Gregory, 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion and some ways that we could perhaps better this practice. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Sicut ora in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Extraordinary ministers. Well, I think most of you who are lifelong Catholics are familiar with these people. And look, I want to be charitable. I will give credit to anybody who's ever done it. I used to do it, and at a certain time in my life, I was an extraordinary minister. I would administer the blood of Christ. And anyone who feels a vocation to be active in your parish, whether it be as a lecturer or an extraordinary minister, or working on the flowers, or the sewing guild, or a greeter, or a Bible study leader, or whatever it is, kudos to you. And I don't want you to feel that I'm insulting you because of your job as an extraordinary minister. That being said, call me a traditionalist. I'm not a big fan of the extraordinary ministers. Now, let's look at the term. So the ordinary ministers are going to be the religious. So if you go to Mass, the ordinary minister is going to be the priest and the deacon, if there's a deacon present. So anyone who's not one of those people would be the extraordinary ministers. So there's a couple options that a priest, a pastor could do at his parish. One would be that he does not have to offer the blood of Christ. This was determined 800 years ago. I think it was in the Council of Florence, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see this in the Catechism, how we receive in just one species, the body, all of Jesus Christ. It's not like I'm being deprived of a certain part of him, because it's a misunderstanding of transubstantiation and misunderstanding the Eucharist in general. And sometimes you see this, it's like, well, my parish doesn't offer me the blood of Christ, I'm feeling deprived. Well, you're just misunderstanding the theology, which is quite normal. But it's something that I would recommend that you look up. You're not being deprived of anything. There are people that want to receive the blood of Christ. And certainly after COVID, there are a lot of people who are like, I'm not touching that cup. And then there's the other group of people who are like, I'm glad. I wouldn't say they're glad COVID happened. Of course not. But one of the ancillary benefits of COVID is like nobody, at least the parishes that I've gone to, is shaking hands. In all honesty, I go to the Ordinary or Chair of St. Peter, so they don't do the peace over there. But when I do go to Novus Ordo parishes or regular parishes, even during the peace, most people just turn around and do they don't even shake hands. So one of the ancillary benefits post-COVID is there are people who don't want to receive from the chalice. And again, that is up to you. If it's offered and you want to receive the blood of Christ, that's great. If you don't want to receive the blood of Christ, that's great. Now, extraordinary ministers, are they needed? Well, I'll tell you this. If you go to a Latin Mass or an Ordinariate Mass, it's a moot point because they don't allow extraordinary ministers at all. It's only the religious. And if you go to these churches, it's truly, the altar is separated. That's what you said, the altar rail. The altar is separated. So it's the acolytes and the priest that's presiding over it, or if there's a deacon. And they're up there on the dais, for lack of a better word, and we, the lay, are behind that. And there's not this movement up into the altar for either the lectors or the extraordinary ministers. So this was the norm until Vatican II, until the rollout of the Novus Ordo, which Vatican II did not roll out the Novus Ordo. Novus Ordo Mass came later. But this was one of the innovations, and I understand why they did it. They wanted to get more lay participation in the Mass. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole of whether or not this is good or bad, but this is why we saw lectors be lay people. They just want to get more active participation for the lay. And so this is one of the things. Now, do you need one? I would say it really depends on a couple of things. The trads will say you don't need one at all. You don't need extraordinary ministers. I would say you have to look at the layout of your church. And this, again, plays into Vatican II as well. If you look at the basilica style of a church, where it's just one long kind of two columns of pews, I would say that you could certainly minimize the amount of extraordinary ministers. Now, I could say this could all be obviated if you just do intinction, and we've talked about it in a previous episode. Intinction is what the ordinariate does. Intinction is what a lot of the Eastern rites do. We just had an episode on the Eastern rites, where, for lack of a better verb, they dip the host into the chalice, and then you receive both species that way. Now, bishop of a certain diocese, I don't see any reason why they couldn't do that. But intinction would make things a lot easier, because if you had intinction and you had a basilica form of architecture, well, you have the priest in one aisle and you have the deacon in the other aisle, and you wouldn't need an extraordinary minister at all. Now, assuming we don't have intinction, in the ordinariate, as I mentioned, one of the arguments for extraordinary ministers is that it would take too long. There's so many people. Let me tell you, man, the priests in the ordinariate and the TLM, they're pretty fast with the altar rails. People know you line up, boom, boom, boom. They're pretty fast. And look, the other thing is that we can't see the Mass as like a vending machine for the Eucharist. And I think this is one of the reasons why the belief in the real presence is not as high as it should be, is because there is this mindset that we have to tolerate the holy sacrifice of the Mass to get to my little token, just being sarcastic, my little token that I receive at the end, and then I can leave before the final blessing. And I think that mindset is wrong. There's no need to have a hurry to administer the Eucharist. This is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. It's almost, you could say, the pinnacle of the Mass. I think we can take our time. Now, going back to Vatican II, one of the innovations, and you really saw this before, like in the 1950s, like with brutalist architecture and so forth. So it was even before Vatican II. But now we have parishes that have multiple aisles. Like they have a fan orientation or a full circular one with the altar in the middle, and some innovations like that, which would then make it almost impossible, unless you're bringing in 2 priests and 4 deacons, for only the ordinary ministers to administer the Eucharist. So in that case, you would probably need, and post in the comments unless you could think of a way to brainstorm around this, some extraordinary ministers. My issue with extraordinary ministers is not necessarily that people do it, it's just I think we have too many of them. We don't need 12 for like 4 pews. And you see this, a lot of you see this who go to just the regular suburban masses, is when it's time to administer the Eucharist, they all come up into the altar, and there's like 10 of them. And I think there's a way, and I guess every church is different, the architecture is different, but I think if a pastor is oriented toward this and has a belief that really extraordinary ministers are tolerated, they're not needed. If you look at canon law, read the catechism, they're not needed, they're not mandatory in a Mass. They're essentially tolerated. You can use them if there's a need. If there's not a need, you don't need them. And I think you have some pastors who are like, let's just another way to get lay involvement. Let's just get as many Eucharistic extraordinary ministers up there. Why not? And I think that's a poor reading of what the church's intention is there. The church's intention is to have minimal extraordinary ministers. So I think look at the architecture of the church, and I think there's ways where we could do, because most masses will have a deacon. So I think there's a way where you could have maybe 2 extraordinary ministers. Again, we're not doing intinction. So 2, 1 for each of the main aisles, and then maybe 4 if you have like the side aisles. The other thing about extraordinary ministers, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying you are administering the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in this holy sacrifice of the Mass. Dress up. And it just breaks my heart, and like I'm trying not to be Pharisaic in this, but it saddens me, and I think this lends partly to the lack of belief in the real presence, because if we truly believe this was the real presence, I think you would see it manifested in the Mass better. If we had solemn music, if people were dressing up like their grandparents did in the 1950s, if the acolytes or the altar boys acted a certain way, if we all had this reverence, I think it would really bring back the presence, the belief of the real presence. At least it would help, it wouldn't hurt. But when the extraordinary ministers go up there, and look, sometimes as a whole, I would not say that this is the majority of times, but I've seen people go up there wearing shorts. Most of the time the men will be wearing like a button down shirt or a polo shirt, but casual slacks, untucked, sometimes with sneakers. The women are wearing elastic pants and maybe an informal blouse. And you guys have all seen it. And I would just say, look, if I am in charge of that, I would be the pastor, and I would just say, look, if you want to be an extraordinary minister, God bless you. You know, we need help, we need volunteers, but you have to dress up. This is the dress code: tie, sports coat, or a suit. Women, you have to wear a dress. This is it. And if you can't abide by this, I understand, then maybe you're not meant to be this. Maybe you could be a lector. But even with the lectors, I always say the lector should dress up. Maybe you could be an usher. Anyone that's involved in the Mass needs to be dressed up, in my humble opinion. And so in closing, with the Eucharistic extraordinary ministers, minimize their use, make sure they're reverential, make sure they know they can't give blessings. Their blessings mean nothing. You can just say, may God love you, or just some platitude, but they cannot give blessings. Lay ministers, lay extraordinary ministers can't not give blessings. Instruct them properly, aside from, you know, what to do if somebody drops the chalice or whatnot. But make sure they understand the reverence. I understand there's people involved in the parish who want to like be involved, and they're more about kind of like, I want to be in the first seat, you know, I want to be seen. And it's less about that and less about, look, you are administering the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ. Act like it, dress up like it, have a certain decorum. The other thing that I would tell with the pastors is, I don't think they need to come up to the altar. I think there's a way where you could have you or the deacon come down to wherever the altar rail is. Your parish probably doesn't have an altar rail, but they could come down and administer it there. I just don't really like non-acolytes and non-clergy up in the altar, but that's just me. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of extraordinary ministers? Did you do it? Do you think I'm completely wrong? Love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. God bless.